So because of the realities of the time we live in and the news cycle and so many things, I'm already thinking about next year's election. Are y'all? Yeah. Which seems both a long way off and like tomorrow at the same time. So that's one of the reasons I think it's so important. I really wanted to participate in this Power Sunday with UUSJ. There are dozens and perhaps hundreds of congregations, UU congregations also doing some version of this today or a different Sunday nearby. I think it's really important to talk about our democracy. So there's a little story I always like to share when I'm talking about voting or democracy. I'll probably share it again at some point when we talk about that again. I just never get tired of it. I'll just tell it to you. The Unitarian Universalist minister David O. Rankin liked to relate a story from his own ministerial career. In 1968, he preached a sermon, as many of us do, just before the presidential election. He was not thrilled between the choice of either Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey, frankly. And so instead of making the case, however subtly, for either candidate, he chose instead to recommend that he hoped everyone would vote for the most intelligent, the most experienced, the most compassionate candidate. A few minutes later, in the receiving line after the service, he was confronted by a man loudly and angrily shouting at him, "How dare you use the pulpit to support Hubert Humphrey?" So I'm reminded that when we talk about voting as a wonderful and a glorious thing, that is true. And it's important to remember that without the sort of civic engagement our reading talk about today, without careful thought, without good informed citizens, you get the kind of votes we too often see now. And probably did in 1968 too. I wasn't there for that one. As in our Time for All Ages this morning, I ultimately think about how we make decisions that affect all of us, even something as relatively trivial as what we might have for dinner, and I think how complicated they can get, because we're talking about how do we judge fairness? Is trying to make everyone, or as many people as possible at least, happy our goal? Does everyone get a vote? Has been a continuing question in our nation's history. If everyone doesn't necessarily get a vote, does everyone at least get to be heard? Is that enough? And so when we speak of democracy, there is a lot in that word. It is a loaded term in so many ways. An ideal to be striven for, a reality to be dealt with. I like to remember that even the word democracy was initially kind of an insult. In ancient Greece, demos, the word that democracy comes from, it meant people, so rule by the people. But in this case, demos didn't really mean all the people. It sort of meant the common people, as in, how on earth would you give all of those commoners these votes on important matters? These unlearned mobs is another translation of demos. And of course, democracy has almost never truly meant that everyone gets a vote. There are always restrictions, some of them probably for good reasons. People under 18 don't vote in our elections, by and large. There's a couple exceptions to that, notably Tacoma Park, a municipality near where I live in Maryland, actually allows people over 16 to vote in their elections. I found that really interesting. Anyway, there are some restrictions that probably make sense. I don't necessarily want my 9-year-old necessarily voting on important matters of the Commonwealth. And then there are really, really bad restrictions, as we've seen over and over, based on race or wealth or gender or any of a number of other issues. There's always questions about who is part of the in-group of people who are actually allowed to vote in any system. And still, with every criticism we can give of democracy, what does it have going for it? Winston Churchill famously put it, and I quote, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Which still holds true for me, I think. And as Peggy Clark in our reading said, we live in a time and a world in which democracy as we have known it is under attack more so than in recent memory. And in many cases, it seems to not be holding up to those attacks. It seems reasonable to ask, indeed, whether that's what's happening in our very own country, where pro-fascist elements have come to real power and influence. In other parts of the world, this is already a reality, in much of Eastern and Central Europe, for instance. And yet, there are little signs of hope, I see. Just this month, Poland gave me hope. This is a little under the radar, but did you hear that progressive parties in Poland won an electoral victory? And this, despite the fact that the pro-fascist parties had been in power, and this was not what we would call a free or fair election. Poland, it turns out, and I already knew this because I know a few Polish people, and I say this with love, is full of a lot of stubborn people. They want to be in charge of their own affairs. And I say this based on my rather limited, but I'm a little bit of a student of Polish history, because one of the things I know is the history of labor and political organizing in the 1980s that effectively toppled communist rule there. So back to us from Poland. How does a little congregation like ours fit into this massive picture of world democracy, one might ask? And I have a story about this. It's a little bit longer than I usually share in my sermons. I hope you'll bear with me. It's about how our congregations don't just participate in the voting part of democracy, which is what we always seem to focus on. I know it's important, the vote, the actual election day. But also, again, as Peggy Clark lifted up, the real work of democracy, I think, happens in that civic engagement, in engaging difficult issues, in talking with people with whom we disagree, in trying to come together to move forward. And that's not a linear process. There are starts and stops and steps back and triumphs and challenges. So today I present to you a story about one of those triumphs, which had its own stops and starts and back steps. This story, this version of the story, which is popular in UU minister circles at least, is by Jessica York. She writes, "This story takes place 75 years ago when most faith communities in the United States were segregated. Segregation was one way the U.S. tried to keep black people in particular separated from white people. Some states required churches to be segregated. Others were segregated because all of the other churches around them did it, or because that's the way things had always been done. We think of our UU faith as progressive, liberal trendsetters, and in some ways we are. But in 1948, the First Unitarian Society of Chicago was segregated. Their church was in a racially diverse neighborhood where people of many colors lived, but only white people were allowed to go to that church. One day, a large group of church members started to organize to collect their power and take action against this practice. The church's minister, the Reverend Leslie Pennington, and a man named James Luther Adams were ready to move things forward. Adams, who I quote all the time, you probably heard me quote him before, Adams was a famous theologian and ethicist. He taught at the Meadville Lombard Theological School, and he was on the congregation's board at the time. Adams and Pennington together made a proposal to the church board to desegregate. They knew this was the right thing to do. They knew it was what their faith guided them to do. And most church members wanted the church to welcome people, no matter what color their skin was. But one member of the board resisted. He said, "Your new program is making desegregation into a creed. You are asking everyone in our church to say they believe desegregating inviting, even recruiting people of color to attend church here is a good way to tackle racism. What if some members don't believe this? So they talked and argued. And they talked and argued some more. And the board meeting was one of those rare board meetings, hopefully in most places, that goes deep, deep into the night, well after midnight, in fact. They were, as some of us from the D.C. area say, gridlocked. And just then, Reverend Adams remembered a piece of wisdom. He said, it's best to listen twice as much as we speak. So instead of arguing his point of view yet again, he asked this board member, who didn't really want the church to desegregate, a simple question. What do you say is the purpose of this church? Somehow, that got everyone's attention. What was the purpose of the church? The board member Adams had been arguing with took a moment and finally said, "Okay, Jim, the purpose of this church is to get a hold of people like me and change them." And that's the story of how that church successfully desegregated. I want to give context to this story because that's a really feel-good part of the story, and it did indeed desegregate. That church is still very much desegregated. It's actually quite racially diverse. I knew the minister there for a long time. I also know that that board member ultimately left the church. And so I say this, that progress isn't linear. It doesn't go always up, always better. But still we have to do it. Still we have to make efforts. Our story continues. The problems we face here and now in 2023 sometimes seem gridlocked, just like that board was in our story. The challenges we face as individuals and families, congregations and neighborhoods, as a whole country, as a world, can feel so big we'll never find a way through them. And yet people have again and again found their way through massive challenges, sometimes by making a way when there was none to begin with, not by bullying one another, not through coercing one another, but by staying at the table, by staying in conversation, by refusing to stay quiet when we see injustice, by collecting the power we each have and leveraging that collective power in service of our faith and values. And so what can we do? I do want to put one more plug in for UUs for Social Justice, which is doing really wonderful work with our federal government, talking about the issues we care about and making a difference. But the thing we can do in our own lives is to continue to engage people we disagree with, talk about how we can be better, keep pushing for justice, keep working for change. The purpose of church, as frustrating and hard and annoying as it is sometimes, is to change people like me and you and all of us. And that's a very good thing. Amen.